That is an enormous statement for so many reasons. One of the things about community, gathering together in community, that is so important and that makes religious community stand out in terms of well-being around the world when people come together into that community. One of the most significant things is that they have a supreme idea which they all sit under, to which they all give their attention, by which they all choose to live. For most religious systems, as we know, that's a divine being, the words of whom have come down to us in a variety of ways, or ostensibly have been revealed or have been written down by other people to explain to us what that divine being wants us to do. And when a community comes together and agrees on what it is that that divine being wants us to do, and they come together regularly in community to adhere to that, to discern what it means if there's some conflict or some interpretation that could go one way or another, and they agree upon that and they hold one another to account for that, it creates a sense of community, a sense of beingness, a sense of acceptance that far exceeds almost anything else that goes toward well-being in someone's life. The sense that you belong, that you're part of a group, that assents to a certain being, to its authority, is very, very strong in religious communities. But what about when there is no divine being? What about when there is no scriptural texts or sacred books or handed down revelations by which we can come together and discern our way forward? If there's no books that we can say, well, I think it means this, and I think it means that, and we can work our way forward, what is that higher authority by which we can come together? We've articulated that here in this space as the supreme value of love. And so despite the fact that it doesn't have the characteristics of a divine being, whether or not those characteristics have some sort of body image according to our anthropomorphic understanding of it, or whether it is a force that guides the universe, if that divine being or divine force or whatever it is challenges us to live with love, then it's totally consistent with ours, but it's not necessary in terms of ours. And we still come together under that banner. And every week I talk about, in the early preamble to the service, that there's nothing universal about that value. There's no single way to interpret it that draws us all under the banner. So just like those complex and contradictory holy texts, we have to come together and say, well, I think it means this. And someone else says, I think it means that. And somewhere along the line, we tie ourselves together by those conversations, by wrestling with that reality, and we place before ourselves over and again, over ourselves, if you want to use that kind of imagery, which is more consistent with religious ideals, the supreme value of love. And so, in many ways, this is a religious community, if you wanted to define it by having a divine authority, because supreme and divine, let's use supreme, but it has an authority over us to which we subscribe and before which we place our lives in judgment, for judgment. We've talked here over the last year, probably since Michael Dowd was here last September, about the future having some of the characteristics of a divine being. That if we were to catapult ourselves, say 7 generations, to use a well-known concept, to catapult ourselves 7 generations into the future and look back on what it is we're doing now, if that 7th generation, always 7 generations to whatever generation, so the 7th generation from now would be looking another 7 generations ahead of them to discern it, if that 7th generation were that divine being piece, or the supreme value of love, existing to help us reflect upon what it is we're doing now, what would that judgment be? Would we have done the things that would let them say, oh yeah, you grew love into the world, and we, 7 generations later, are benefiting from it. You lived according to a value that guided you to build compassion in relationships, to understand the diversity of the world and not shy away from it, but lean into it, seeing it as something beautiful and of value for all. And we, 7 generations, are benefiting from that. You cared for the space that you were put upon on this planet, that little territory that was yours, cared for it in a way that had a ripple effect around this world, and we, 7 generations, are benefiting from that. It sounds almost like the kind of judgment that a divine being had over groups when they came together and said, well, what do you think? What do you think he or she meant by this? And it almost always came down to the sense that compassion and justice and living in right relationship were the things that needed to be done. The understanding of ethics, virtues ethic, which seems to flow, according to Hans Kung, seems to flow across all religious traditions, is an ancient concept built into those axial religions that Karen Armstrong talks about in a variety of different ways, but always coming back to the ethic of love, of compassion, and of justice as being the guiding principles. So Kung seems to believe that we should be able to build again a virtues ethic upon which we could walk, through which we could see our neighbors and determine our response to them, and by which we could set sort of a global principle by which nations should live. The problem is, as Jeffrey Sachs says in the United Nations Happiness Report from 2013, the problem is not everybody's going to agree. Not everybody's going to see the same virtues as primary. And that's where Kung's report from a couple of decades ago comes in, and the argument is, but maybe we could start here and build our way up. Because imposing a system of ethics on nations or groups or peoples is simply not going to work. But can we find our way to a virtues ethic? And is that something that West Hill has been busy doing? One of the first words in this section of the VisionWorks document is the word choose. We choose. And I'm going to use that concept, the concept of choice, to work our way through it, skimming it as I do, but allowing you to engage in far more depth after the service today or on Wednesday evening or Thursday morning this week in a facilitated conversation that will build upon what it is that I've said today, but more deeply upon what it is that was written 5 years ago. We've had some commendations about the work that we're doing, the fact that we are even bothering to reflect on something that we wrote 5 years ago, that this is the second time we've done it since it was written 10 years ago. Some find that quite shocking and very refreshing. Many of us work in organizations that paste those things on the wall and then never actually look at them again. But I'm going to refer to 2 documents that have been written and that to which we as a congregation are signatories that probably won't get much revision over time. Because they're the compilation of a group of people, each of them separately, groups of people who have thought and worked their way through a principle in order to bring it to the document that it is today. And the sense is that that document kind of stretches itself to embrace as much as would need to be embraced, and so it may not need revision. It may be that sometime we get to the point where we don't think that VisionWorks needs to be revised, but I'm hoping that you engage in that process this time, because we do need to look at it. We have evolved, we've changed, we think differently, we bring new stuff to the table than we did 5 years ago. Sometimes people say to me, but that's not what you said in blah, blah, blah. And I lean back on the words that a therapist once said to me some time ago, I've grown. We can always change our minds. And so we're growing. And as we look at this document again, and if we come up with something that's very different, even contradictory to what we thought 5 years ago, we can just say, we've grown. The two documents that I want to bring your attention to came to mind as I was reading this section because of the elements of this part of VisionWorks that are before us today. And the first one is the Earth Charter, and the second one is the Charter of Compassion. And West Hill has chosen to sign both of those charters as they came to us some years ago. And so I'm going to talk about what they're about and how we are called to them, because I think that what's within those documents speaks about what we're trying to do with this section of VisionWorks, this recognition that we choose love as our supreme value, and that choice itself is what rests upon us, both as privilege and as responsibility. Within our tradition, the Christian tradition out of which we are growing as a community of people struggling to find their way forward in a complex world, the idea of choice was often given to us as free will, which allowed us to have the sense that the divine being by which we ordered our religious understandings and our theological wrestlings, that divine being actually had some kind of control over everything, perhaps a plan, but that we could align ourselves with it or mess it up. And free will was a big part of that. So while that divine being wanted us to live in love and light and on into eternity in that same manner, we could mess it up through our free will. Choice under the banner of love is the privilege to live according to our convictions, to make choices in terms of our relationships, to allow ourselves dignity and offer dignity to the other. It's not going to catapult us into a world beyond or a life beyond this one for which we have no parameters or understanding, and many of us don't believe that there is one. It's not going to protect us there or send us into the outer darkness where there is weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth should we choose things that are at variant with the concept of love. But it does help us guide our choices. And so the fact that we have the privilege of making choices is a huge element of how we have come to create this document. There are places in the world where the ability to create a document like this would not exist, the opportunity, where the privilege of choice does not belong to individuals. That choice is actually handed down by an authority that states what it is. There are some religious traditions that do that. There are some national nations that make those kinds of decisions, whether secular or aligned with religious tradition. I've made just 5 copies of the Earth Charter and 5 copies of the Charter of Compassion, and they're on the table out in the lobby if you'd like to pick it up. Many of you are able to find those on the internet, so I'd encourage you to do that rather than to take a paper copy and reserve those for those who don't have access to computers. And if anyone needs a copy of it printed off, please let me know after the service and I'll be happy to print a few more off for you. But one of the things about the Earth Charter, we speak about our interconnectedness and the web of life. And when you consider the Earth Charter, the first thing that comes to mind is the idea of environmental sustainability, of ecological diversity, of taking care of the planet, perhaps of responding to things like climate change. And the Earth Charter definitely focuses on those things. But it also speaks about social justice. It also speaks about how we are with one another. It talks about the social economies and about values and how we need to treat one another, because it recognizes that inherent in our own sense of well-being is the way that we will respond to life on that planet. That if we have within ourselves a sense that there isn't enough out there and we have to protect what it is that we have and get more so that we don't ever live without, then we will crush the resources that the earth has to share with the rest of life on it. So it's only when we're coming from a recognition that we exist within this web, that we're responsible to that web, that we can actually begin the things of thinking about ecological diversity and caring for that, and environmental and ecological sustainability. So the Earth Charter speaks to us very clearly about how we are to be with one another. It's a choice for us to recognize that this world needs to be cared for. And the choices that we make, the choices we are encouraged to make in the culture in which we exist, are choices that are based upon what we believe we deserve. Many commercials, many marketing campaigns are based on what we deserve. They tell you you deserve this or you deserve that. They place before you a variety of options of things that you probably wouldn't have even thought of before, except once they're placed before you, it's like, oh, I think I need that, and certainly I deserve it. Scott and I began watching the BBC production Selfridges or something on a new form of marketing that was introduced to England in the early 20th century. And Mr. Selfridge, who started that marketing plan, was behind our idea of shopping now. Whereas before, if you wanted a dress, you'd contact a dressmaker and say, okay, what are we going to do here? Selfridge felt that if you put a whole pile of dresses in front of a bunch of women, they were going to go for them, regardless of whether they were personally made for them or not. And isn't that exactly what we do? And so that idea of marketing, of placing stuff before us, of putting in our mind ideas of what it is we need, has taken such an incredible hold on us that we sometimes forget, oh, wait a minute. The supreme value is love. And it's not just of myself. I have to think of what the cost of this is. Who made it? What conditions did they make it in? How did it get here? What was the cost to the planet of that? What if the communities and the corporations that made this, what if they had to pay back the carbon cost of what it took to make this was? Would I really be able to pick it up for $17.98 on the bargain rack? Or would I really be paying much more for that, viewing it from the seventh generation? The Earth Charter speaks to us of our interconnectedness, not just in terms of ecological diversity, but in terms of our relationships with one another and with that seventh generation. When I move on to the Charter of Compassion, it was brought together. It was a TED Prize that Karen Armstrong won several years ago, $100,000, I think, to get a Charter of Compassion going and to try to get signatories around the world to sign on to it. Essentially aligning it with many of those, that virtues ethics that Karen recognizes came out of those axial first axial time, and recognizing that we're in another time when the shift and the change in religious understandings and ethics and morals is so significant that now is the time we need to name these things and take them forward. And so in the Charter of Compassion, she speaks about how we live together and how we choose to live. And I have it on a video, and I'm bravely going to head into a video right now.
The principle of compassion lies at the heart of all religious, ethical, and spiritual traditions,
calling us always to treat all others as we wish to be treated ourselves.
Compassion impels us to work tirelessly to alleviate the suffering of our fellow creatures,
to dethrone ourselves from the center of our world and put another there,
to honor the inviolable sanctity of every single human being,
treating everybody without exception,
with absolute justice, equity, and respect.
It is also necessary in both public and private life
to refrain consistently and empathically from inflicting pain,
to act or speak violently out of spite, chauvinism, or self-interest,
to impoverish, exploit, or deny basic rights to anybody,
and to incite hatred by denigrating others, even our enemies,
is a denial of our common humanity.
We acknowledge that we have failed to live compassionately.
And that some have even increased the sum of human misery in the name of religion.
We therefore call upon all men and women
to restore compassion,
To the center of morality and religion.
To return to the ancient principle
that any interpretation of Scripture
That breeds violence,
hatred,
or disdain
is illegitimate.
To ensure that youth are given accurate and respectful information
About other traditions, religions, and cultures.
to encourage a positive appreciation of cultural
And religious diversity.
to cultivate
An informed empathy
with the suffering of all human beings,
even those
regarded as enemies.
We urgently need to make compassion a clear, luminous, and dynamic force in our polarized world.
rooted in a principled determination to transcend selfishness.
Compassion can break down political, dogmatic, ideological, and religious boundaries.
Born of our deep interdependence, compassion is essential for human relationships and to a fulfilled humanity.
It is the path to enlightenment and indispensable in the creation of a just economy and a peaceful global community.
I'm incredibly impressed by how Karen Armstrong managed to get those who assisted her in the writing of that to compress into that few words a concept that religious communities and people of conscience have been struggling to articulate for centuries, if not millennia. That she was able to place in there the challenge for us to work together, particularly in relation to our religious communities and the traditions that we have come out of, is an incredible feat and an accomplishment that we at West Hill recognized was worthy of being part of some years ago. And so we signed on to it, as have many religious communities and cities around the world. And so I do urge you to go online and to read it and to print it out and to contemplate it, perhaps as part of our reflections on this part of our VisionWorks document. But there is one thing about which I am incredibly passionate. Those are little Facebook things coming up because we're using my computer, so anytime someone updates their profile, it's showing up. I'm going, bleedly sorry about that, Hal. Just one of those blips. One of the things, and you know this, that I am most passionate about is the concepts that are related to religion and religious community and religious belief, and how they do and do not make our world more beautiful. That there are people of faith around this world who use the principles of their religious traditions to bring this world to a place of compassion and beauty, to shine light and love into individual hearts, to work to bring justice into situations of injustice, and who give of themselves and of their time and of their energy and of their resources to be about that work, is a fact that we must acknowledge and honor. But to recognize that there are too, within every religious tradition around the world, also those people who use those religious traditions and the principles that they bind themselves to related to it, to deny rights, to oppress, to wreak violence, to act unjustly, to prevent others from accessing the things of life, the basic necessities of life. That too is very, very true. And we have known it for a long time. Consider Miriam Ibrahim, a Sudanese woman who at 8 months pregnancy has been found guilty of refusing to convert to Islam from Christianity. Born to a Christian mother and a Muslim father, her father left the family early on, and her mother raised her as a Christian. She married a Christian. She continues to live as a Christian. But that is illegal according to Islamic law in Sudan. And so she has been tried and told that she was given a certain number of days to convert. She refused to do so, and so she is due to be executed after her child is born. I believe 2 years after the child is born, she will be executed for her belief. Canada has an Office of Religious Freedoms that would stand in and perhaps speak to that situation, to argue that she has a right to have and hold her Christian faith and to not be persecuted for it. And that seems to us to be a no-brainer. Of course we would want someone to be able to choose the faith that they want to live by, and of course she should not be interfered with. But religious freedom also allows a nation to determine the religion by which it chooses its people to live. And so, how do we fight for religious freedoms on a personal level and not comment on it on a national level? Think now of Raif Badawi, who, a Saudi Arabian liberal thinker, began a chat site online in order to encourage dialogue, to allow people to express their ideas about their faith, to engage in discourse that could move people forward and community forward, and to critique some of the religious ideologies that are present in his land, and who has been sentenced to 1,000 lashes and 10 years in jail as a result of doing that work. What are his religious freedoms when he doesn't actually identify as a religious person? But the state, we tiptoe back from because it has a religious identity which it wants to hold to, and we don't want to get in the way of that. I believe that religious freedoms have to be looked at in a very careful and cautious way. And while I don't believe that we need to run into people's homes and tear their religious texts out of their hands, I think that would be inappropriate. In the common area, when religious freedoms impinge on the rights of others to access the legal system, to make choices that they would choose to live with integrity, and that's one of the principles in VisionWorks that's lifted up in this section, to live with integrity, then religious freedoms need to take a back seat to what needs to come forward in community and the virtues, ethics that Karen Armstrong suggests and Jeffrey Sachs suggests are so important. The United Nations Index on Happiness report came out in 2013. It's the first time that report was looked at after the big global economic crash of 2008. And so it was expected, and of course it showed that many countries in the world, far and away most countries in the world, had slid backwards in the terms of happiness, in the sense of well-being that the people within those communities felt. Economic conditions, we all know, have a significant effect, but we live in a culture that continues to tell us that economic success will bring us happiness and well-being. How many people actually believe that? Didn't think so. But out there, and sometimes in the choices that we make in our lives, we think it'll make a big difference. We think it'll make us happy. Around the world, country after country after country registered a slip in well-being related to economic realities. But Jeffrey Sachs, who writes a chapter in that report, argues that we've got to think of morality, and we've got to think of the individual's ability to act according to their moral compass as a significant element in that sense of well-being. When countries refuse to allow individuals, participants, citizens to function in a way that brings integrity to them, that lives out of what they believe and what they morally think is right, when a country denies that, that individual's sense of well-being is diminished. And so Sachs believes that we have to lift that up. We have to make people more aware of that. We can't just look at economic conditions as a way to determine what the future needs of a country, of a citizenship are. If we can create moral fabric within communities that is consistent with the values of compassion and love and justice, and that weaves community together under those banners, perhaps in the same way we've set love as our supreme authority, then Sachs believes that we will slowly but surely move that index up a little bit. Incidentally, in that report, against all odds, Canada's sense of well-being had inched itself forward, completely different than what had happened in most of the world, including our neighbor to the south. So what I want to draw your attention to mostly about this section of VisionWorks is that cohesive nature of our identifying a supreme authority, of our articulating that love is our supreme value, and of getting our heads around the idea of that as something discrete in a way and integrated in a way, so that immanent and transcendent value of love, that guides us and binds us together as a community. And that binding is one of the most important elements of what community is. That we are bound to one another, that we are bound to that ideal, that we are bound to struggling through the conversations that ideal places in our midst, because we're never going to agree on exactly what it means. That is one of the most important things that we do as a community. That is, in fact, the reason we are community. And that because we are community, bound to that value and bound to one another, that on that happiness scale, our sense of well-being would be incredibly positively affected. Imagine then whole communities beyond this place that read the newspaper, the front headlines of which would speak about how we raced in to make a difference in someone's life, about how we overcame poverty and oppression, about how we sacrificed ourselves day by day to bring about beauty and goodness and truth into our communities. Imagine what the impact of getting a paper slapped on your front desk, or your browser opening up and you're showing you the news of the world, and all of it being about how we were adhering to the supreme value of love and living that out in our individual lives, in our small, close-knit families and friends, in the communities that come together in geographic or ideological synchronicities. Imagine what that would do if we saw that there was a way that we could come together and talk, not just because we need to and we need to, but because we want to, and because we believe that 7 generations from now, that's what would have made the most difference. Thank you. sometimes one of the bravest things you can do is look in the mirror and see who you really are, and see how your background and the realities in which you grew, the culture in which you are a part, have affected who you are and allowed you to be more or less compassionate, understanding, tolerant. Perhaps that's one of the bravest things we can do. So I want you, when you go home and you stand in front of that mirror tonight when you're brushing your teeth, or if you don't look at it until you get up tomorrow morning, and wow, I want you to look in your eyes, and I want you to see something that is so holy, so beautiful, that no matter what the background of it was, no matter what you come to that moment with, you know that you've got a community that will celebrate you into beauty, that will call you over and over again into goodness, and that will hold you through whatever it is you think is staring back at you. So go from this place, find your mirror, find you, and take that to the world. Go in peace.